Lova diena! I'm greeting you at the end of the build, and there's a reason for that. I made a couple of crucial mistakes. First one being, I somehow bumped up the ISO on my camera, and all of the footage up to this point is in terribly low quality. I really don't want to torture you, but I still have to go through some of the processes and explain how I got here. And once we are done with that, I will tell you about the second issue I have. Obviously, it has to start with the lumber, so I'm looking through my ash stock for the usable pieces. Then I move to the panel saw and break these into a little bit oversized pieces. I need that extra material because I will have to do the milling and sanding. Well, needless to explain, but woodworking is basically starting big and working your way down to the final dimension. After the stock was milled, the next step was obviously to glue the pieces, and these will become the legs. So once the glue dried, I cleaned those up and ran it through the thickness planer to make the stock completely square. The only problem is that I got some tear out, so that's why I moved to the white belt sander and sanded this until it was smooth. And then back to the panel saw, squaring the ends and cutting the legs to the final length. And I decided that these look too bulky, so I made this quick jig to cut the taper. So basically it sits in that sheet, and every single cut is equal to the previous one, and I end up with tapered legs on two sides only. The other two sides are straight 90. Unfortunately, the disc on the panel saw was a little bit too small to cut all the way through the material, so that's why I'm using the bandsaw to finish up the cuts. And then I was left with a little bit of a lip, so I cleaned it up with a palm plane, and the legs were more or less finished. A little bit of sanding was left to do, and it's done. And obviously legs are not all the pieces needed for the table base, so I had quite some more cutting and milling to do. So yeah, not that much to explain about this process anymore. At last all of the pieces were prepared, and next step was to cut these cross members to the final lengths. What I like to do is lay out the real sized base straight on the table and measure from there. This eliminates the potential for human error instead of relying on the drawing, because the stock may differ while making, so measuring it real sized is the way to go. So once I had the pieces cut, it was time for assembly. But first of all, I had to create these corner pieces which will hold the leg to the skirt itself. And as you can see, these pieces are really simple, and what I'm doing here, basically enlarging the area which will meet with the skirt apron. I still don't know how that frame to call. Anyhow, so I'm pre-drilling the holes for the screws, and now I'm securing the whole frame with the clamps. There's no glue at this point, and once I had the structure rigid enough, then I started the glue up and like basic assembly. And since this is the inside of the table and nobody will see this part, so I went with the strongest and simplest method: glue, brad nails and some screws. By the way, the legs are attached only by those lag bolts, no extra fasteners added, no glue, nothing. So it's really convenient when you have to apply the finish, and also super convenient for delivery, because you can take the base apart and deliver it in pieces. And if you are like me, you are probably worried that those lag bolts will not be enough for the stability of the table, but trust me, it's super sturdy. I thought that I'm done with the base, so I switched on making the tabletop. So the idea was that the tabletop has to be made out of plywood, but I didn't like that the sheet is thin, and also I didn't want that exposed edge of the plywood. So I decided to cover it with the same ash frame, and also increase the thickness, so the tabletop would look a bit more solid. So that's what these L-shaped pieces are for. Well, the next step is obvious. I had to cut the plywood to the final dimension, and that was a neat trick when you are working alone in the workshop and you have to move big sheets of material. You can basically drag it on its edge. It's basically all you have to do is balance the sheet, and it doesn't require any force at all. Of course, that creates a little bit of an issue because you have to cut away that damaged edge, but I do that every time, even if material looks crisp, because you never know if it was cut perfectly square in the factory. Now I had to cut the ash stock at 45 degrees to wrap around the plywood sheet. And even though it seems simple, it requires a lot of precision, because all of the joints will be really exposed and visible. So it took me a few trials to make it right. So the glue up was fairly stressful because the pieces are long, but it ended up okay. So a little bit of sanding and cleanup, and we are back to square one. The second problem is that I made this base too small for the tabletop. Somehow I thought that some overhang of the tabletop would look okay, but it just doesn't. This base just dissolves under the tabletop, and I think I have to expand it to the maximum width and length, so it would look okay. In other words, I have to tear this base apart and make a new one. That's a bummer. But before breaking anything, I decided I should finish the tabletop, because the dimensions are fine, it's looking great. So I quickly sanded it, removed any finger marks or any stains, and I moved it to the painting booth to apply a few coats of polyurethane lacquer. So I've applied the first coat of lacquer, and while that was curing, I started working on the base. So first of all, I removed every single screw I found, and of course legs were fine, because these were not glued, only attached with screws. So these are fully salvageable. But I also wanted to salvage these corners, because those holes were drilled by hand, so I really wanted to match the corner pieces with the legs, so I wouldn't have any trouble securing these for the next base. And as you can see, it went better than I anticipated. And luckily I was able to salvage these long pieces, which I will use as short pieces on the next base. So here's what I will be using for the upcoming frame. back to the painting booth, a quick scuff with 400 grit sandpaper, and I'm applying the second coat. And that's basically all is needed for the inner side of the tabletop. And for the top side, for the visible side, I will be applying, I believe, 4 coats, maybe even 5 coats in total, which is redundant, but I had some problems with teeny tiny flies sticking to the varnish, and I had to keep on reapplying the finish until it was perfect. And I'm back on building the base, but for so I had quite a lot of cleanup to do on those salvaged pieces, because there was some material stuck on the inside, so I sanded it off. I could have used planer, but for the very same reason I explained at the beginning of this video, I wanted to reduce any chance of tear out, so I just sanded it away. Unfortunately for me, I couldn't think of any better way of removing the material apart from the chisel. So yeah, I took my time and removed it bit by bit, and it worked out great actually. And it was time to make missing components for the base. So basically all of these processes are just the same as at the beginning of the video. So breaking the lumber, milling it and cutting it to the final length and width. Last I had all of the pieces prepared and it was time for assembly. So just like the last time, I'm putting the clamps around the base so it wouldn't lose its shape, and then I'm attaching the corner pieces first by using some wood glue, some brad nails, just to allow for quick clamping, and then I drive in the screws and eventually a couple of lag bolts to hold the legs in place. Since the tabletop is made out of plywood, so I don't have to worry about the wood movement, and I can simply use pocket holes, pocket screws for attaching the tabletop. And I'm on my final stretch, taking everything apart, cleaning the parts and preparing those for the varnish application. And this project is basically finished. So a quick inspection with my colleague. He approves the looks and it's off to the client's place. Sincerely thank you for being with me, and I really hope to see you soon. Bye bye!